So, good morning everyone, and today's talk I've entitled Releasing the Unwholesome and Cultivating the Perfections. It's a talk about how we can let go of unwholesome patterns, unwholesome tendencies, and how we can cultivate the wholesome. Today I'd like to talk about in terms of the unwholesome, I'll be talking about something called the fetters and referring to kilesa. Kilesa basically are unwholesome tendencies. And in terms of the wholesome tendencies, I'll be talking about something called the 10 perfections, or the parameters, the 10 parameters in Theravada Buddhism, and there's 6 parameters in Mahayana Buddhism. So there's sometimes it's said about the Buddha's Eightfold Path as being a path of releasing the unwholesome and cultivating the wholesome. That's it in simple terms. So when we talk about unwholesome is that those tendencies of body, mind and speech, behaviors that lead towards more entanglement in dukkha. They lead towards dukkha. And they lead to it, they may not be so evident as leading towards dukkha in the short term, but in the long term they lead towards dukkha. In Pali they're called the akusala. Kusala and akusala are terms that we refer to as wholesome or unwholesome. Wholesome, kusala; unwholesome, akusala. So akusala leads to more and more suffering, basically, and they entangle us in dukkha, and that which leads towards happiness, peace, and freedom in the long run is called kusala, or wholesome, the wholesome tendencies. So in Pali, the patterns that are called patterns of mind and body and speech that keep us entangled in suffering, they're unwholesome, but they are called kilesa. Kilesa sometimes translates as distortions, like distortions of mind. Sometimes they're also translated as defilements, and it's a bit of a strong term, I think, but if you can think about how, if you consider our mind like clear and pure, like the Buddha mind is clear and pure and untainted, then what happens with the defilements is that they come in and taint it, and they cloud that Buddha mind. They cloud that Buddha nature. They infest it, so to speak. So the roots of the term kilesa really means to distort. So we no longer see a clear perspective of something that's happening, and they come in and blemish our purity, if that makes sense. So what are some examples of the kilesa? Basically they are tendencies, or patterns of body, mind and speech, patterns of our behavior that are driven by greed, ignorance and hatred. And you've heard me talk about greed. Greed is the attachment to the pleasant, craving after, grasping, clinging, being addicted with the pleasant. Ignorance is sort of like ignoring the way things are, or not really seeing the way things are, not being clear about the way things are, misunderstanding, misapprehending, misperceiving. And hatred's another term for aversion, rejection, condemnation, avoidance sometimes, avoidance when it's not necessary to avoid. And this hatred is, also ill will. It kind of is divisive, and it traps us, it isolates us, it cuts us off from seeing things as they actually are. So there are there's a lot of kilesa in our minds. As long as we have kilesa, I should say, we have dukkha, because it's the kilesa that causes the dukkha. So there are some unwholesome patterns that are called the fetters. 10 fetters, actually. 10 fetters. A fetter is something that holds us back. It binds us. It doesn't let us. It binds us to something, so we can't move forward. Well, these are the 10 fetters, basically. A fetter called the personality view. This is clinging to an idea that we are our personalities. It's kind of like a fusing with this view that I'm here and I am this and you are that. It's this creation that people are their personalities. It's this personality view that, how can I explain this really clearly? It's rather than seeing people and beings in the world as the result of causes and conditions coming together, that they're interdependent experiences that arise and come together and called a self. What we're seeing in the world is that people are individual, separate personality structures. I don't know if I've explained it very clearly, but let me tell you that that's a hindrance. It's a fetter. It's something that holds us back in the world of in waking up and so on. Paralyzing doubt, I've mentioned before, is another fetter. Paralyzing doubt, as I said, is this uncertainty about something. It's a chronic procrastination. It's a doubt and a lack of confidence in ourselves and a confidence in the path. And we just don't move forward. We get paralyzed. We get stuck. Another fetter is clinging to rites and rituals. Clinging to rites and rituals means that we tend to believe in sort of magical beliefs, I suppose. It's clinging to this idea that if we do this particular ritual, some positive result will result. Positive outcome will result. But in fact, the way things arise and pass away, the way things, good outcomes come, is by creating good causes, creating good karma, so to speak. This clinging to rites and rituals becomes a fetter because we cling to these ideas, these magical ideas that, if we go and see someone and they'll wave their hand across their head and they'll give us a magic wand or something like that, they'll cure us. Whereas in fact, the way we cure whatever we are afflicted with is by our own actions, our own efforts. I've talked about that first hindrance as craving for sensual pleasures, and pleasure's fine. Pleasure's actually quite healthy. It's when we cling to it and crave after it that it becomes a real fetter and it becomes a hindrance. And of course it gives rise to addictions. Ill will is another fetter. Ill will is this aversion to things, as I was mentioning before. It is condemnation, aversion, avoidance, pushing away, rejection. And the way this works is that it feeds into a sense of divisiveness. It strengthens our sense of being cut off. It entraps us in our own world, and what happens is that we're projecting ill will towards ourselves, such as when I see people who are depressed, they're often projecting ill will towards themselves, and it projects ill will towards the world out there, like everything out there is wrong. And it just cuts us off from seeing the reality of things. Another fetter is craving. Craving for form, craving for sensual pleasures, but also cravings for things we can see, feel, and otherwise perceive. Craving is a cause of great suffering. Craving is this insistence on something to own something, to have something, to consume something. And it is a major hindrance because we can't actually own anything actually, because things arise and pass away. We can't actually possess anything. We can have momentary pleasures from the gratification of our senses, but these pleasures are so momentary that they are ultimately unsatisfactory. There's another. This is the seventh fetter now is craving for immaterial things, and that includes craving for ideas and concepts and mental things, mentalizing in some ways. The eighth fetter is conceit. I've given whole talks about conceit. The conceit I am, the belief that we are our ego, like clinging to an ego, that is a major hindrance. And I won't give a big talk about this right now, but we tend to go around in the world clinging to this ego of self-concept that I am something. The more we cling to it, the more I am, say I'm a psychologist or I'm a good Dharma teacher or whatever, the more I cling to that, the more suffering I have when I start to make mistakes, like, forgetting the hindrances or forgetting some Dharma point or something like that. If I cling to this idea that I'm a good Dharma teacher, for example, I'm a good Dharma teacher, the more I cling to that, the more suffering I have, because eventually I will not be a good Dharma teacher sometimes, and the very fact of clinging to this self-concept is in itself suffering in the long run, because it eventually changes. The other hindrance the other fetter that I mentioned is restlessness. Restlessness, and this is a hindrance as well. Restlessness is when the mind gets scattered, it can't sort of settle. It's like the mind is all over the place. It's like throwing a stone into the ash of a fire. All the ash gets spread and it just doesn't settle anywhere. When we're restless, we are agitated. Rumination and worry are examples of restlessness. Our minds are all over the place. We can't settle. We can't feel at ease. So this is a real hindrance, and it's also a fetter. It holds us back because we just can't settle. And the last fetter is ignorance. And I mentioned a little bit before what ignorance is. From a Buddhist perspective, ignorance and delusion are the same. Ignorance, in this sense, means that we ignore the way things are. We're not quite seeing the way things are. We're misperceiving it and we're misunderstanding it. So there's a lot of hindrances. There's a lot of kilesa. There's a lot of fetters in our lives. And what happens is when they manifest, we start to experience suffering. And the way we work with them, are many. But in my experience, the way we can work with them is by, hold on a second, I'm just going to move something. One way we work with when we notice something's got hold of us and is influencing us is by being present with it, noticing it, knowing it. Because the way the kilesa operate is that they deceive us. They make us believe that we are those kilesa. We identify with them. They're deceiving. We identify with them. They cause us to deny what's happening, to avoid what's happening. They make us look away from seeing the reality of what's going on. They cause us a lot of suffering, actually. And there's many ways of working with them. Rather than engaging with them, rather than being seduced by them, rather than being sucked into them, what we do is we begin to know them, we begin to see them. We begin to see what they're doing to us. We turn our attention to them in a way where we're bringing wisdom and mindfulness to this experience, rather than being sucked into them. It's like we feed the kilesa. And many of you have heard that old saying of an old red American, indigenous and American Indian, a grandmother who's being approached by her grandson, and the grandson's asking her, "How come you are so wise? How come you are so compassionate?" And she responds to her grandson, "Oh, grandson, it's like I have two wolves. One wolf is mean and nasty. One wolf is aggressive. One wolf is full of greed and full of hatred and full of ignorance. And the other wolf is wise and compassionate. The other wolf is filled with generosity and kindness and compassion. And it's like I feed the good wolf and I don't feed the bad wolf. That's how I work with this. That's how I'm so kind and compassionate and wise." And it's like that with the kilesa, actually. What we tend to do is we nourish the kilesa by engaging in them, by believing them, by being deceived by them, by feeling enticed by them. Like, I remember, I noticed that when I'm craving chocolate, for example, there's a little voice that says, "Oh yeah, it's okay, Malcolm. You can just have that piece of chocolate, it's all right. Just one little piece." And then I have that piece, it's okay, just another piece. There's this little voice that says to me, "It's okay, Malcolm. It's good for you. Blah, blah, blah." Or it could be anything, actually. It's that little voice. In Buddhism, that voice is called Mara, actually. Mara, the deceiver, the tempter. Mara is the personification of all that is evil, actually. And Mara comes along and tempts us. He or she comes along and says, "It's okay, don't believe your wisdom, don't believe your wise voice. Believe this voice, believe my voice." And so we feed into these things. We get deluded by our what's happening in our mind, and rather than seeing them clearly, they pull us along, suck us in, and we're caught up in strengthening them. It's like we're feeding the bad wolf. So one way we can work with these is by identifying them, naming them, bringing mindfulness and wisdom to them. In fact, what we do is we can bring the 7 factors of awakening to them. And these are 7 factors of awakening. I'll just mention them to you briefly. We've talked about these many times with most of you. They are mindfulness, investigation of Dharmas, energy, joy, tranquility, concentration, and equanimity. We bring these qualities to our experience and we can see into them. But most importantly, I think at this stage, it's really important to bring mindfulness and investigation to these experiences. And energy comes along as well, because it just energy to the perseverance of questioning what this is, what's happening. So you might be having something happen. You might be having a kilesa arising. You might be having one of the fetters arising. And if you can name it, you're there. You're partway there. You name it. You see it for what it is. It's like, the Buddha once said, "I see you, Mara. insofar as he could see what was happening. He could see the tempter. As soon as he named it, he could see it, then it lost a lot of its power. So we name it and we bring awareness to it. And sometimes this is really, really uncomfortable, because when we're in the middle of, say, a craving for a sensual pleasure, we don't want to name it. We want to get, we want to have the sensual pleasure, for example. Nothing wrong with pleasure, by the way. Don't beat yourself up because you like chocolate or you like sex or whatever it is. There's nothing wrong with pleasure. It's just the clinging and the deception that pleasure gives us that's the problem. It's the when we bring greed, ignorance, and hatred to our pleasures, then they're really problematic, because that leads to addictions and, you know, the slippery slide into unhappiness and misery. So what happens with the kilesa is we notice them, we know them, and like I said, it can be really, really uncomfortable, because we're in a pattern here. We want to just follow through with it. We want to follow through with our aggression. If we have anger arise, for example, and we want to say something really horrible and hurtful to someone, and there's such a strong drive to do that. But if we can bring mindfulness to that, if we can see it for what it is, we can then also inquire into this. It's like we say, I know what you're doing. I know what's happening. I can be mindful of this. I can see it. And in that process, we're not nourishing it. We're not nourishing it. We're not feeding into it. We feed into it by entertaining it. We feed into it by believing it. We feed into them by agreeing with them. We feed into them by not seeing them clearly with mindfulness and wisdom. So yet another way of working with the kilesa, or the unwholesome, is by cultivating the wholesome. And this is actually what the talk's about. It's mostly about cultivating what's called the perfections. And the wholesome are all those patterns of mind, body, speech and mind, that lead towards freedom, lead towards peace, lead towards happiness, genuine happiness, lead towards a deep security in the long run. And they are the opposites of greed, being generosity, for example, the opposites of hatred, being goodwill, and the opposites of ignorance, being wisdom. And these qualities we can cultivate. Now, we cultivate them in many different ways. But I'd like to mention that there are 10 perfections, and there are 10 perfections in Theravada Buddhism and 7 in Mahayana Buddhism. These perfections in Theravada Buddhism are called generosity, virtue, renunciation, discernment or wisdom, energy or persistence, patience or endurance, truth, determination, goodwill, and equanimity. And in Mahayana Buddhism, there are 6 perfections, and I'll tell you about why there are different numbers about them in a minute. There's a large overlap with the 10 perfections as they're described in Theravada Buddhism and those that are described in Mahayana Buddhism. In Mahayana Buddhism, they are generosity, morality or ethics, patience, diligence, meditation, and in particular samadhi or concentration meditation, and wisdom. So the way these perfections work, and the way they were kind of derived, they were derived by looking at the Buddha's Jataka tales. Jataka tales are stories of previous life of the Buddha. And all the previous lives of the Buddha, it's said that he spent lifetimes perfecting particular qualities so that he could become a Buddha. like he would spend one lifetime perfecting patience, for example, another lifetime perfecting generosity, and so on. And the various schools of Buddhism, they looked at these particular cultivations of perfections, and they looked at them and they analysed them. They said, well, these are the particular qualities that are worth cultivating to help us reach the perfection of a Buddha. So the Buddha, an all-awakened one, is an arahant as well as a perfected one, in that not only has this being woken up to the way things are, but they've also perfected their human qualities to an awakened standard, a perfect standard. And these awakening qualities have been taken up by Mahayana Buddhism to be called the path of the Bodhisattva, for example. With the Bodhisattva is someone who is leading towards becoming a Buddha, a perfected one. So the paramis, they're called the paramis in Sanskrit. The paramis are those qualities that we spend lifetimes perfecting in order to become a Buddha. And what's wonderful about these paramis is that there are qualities that we bring to our daily lives, as well as leading towards awakening. There are qualities that we bring towards our daily lives in a way that builds a wonderful character, a person, not that we identify with that person, but a character, a strength of being that is admirable and that is perfected. So these qualities are wonderful ways to bring Dharma into our daily lives. And I mentioned the qualities before, and I'm just going to go through them one by one to describe what they are, and also to have a mention of how we can cultivate them and how useful they are in our daily lives. So generosity. Generosity is called dana in Pali. Generosity is giving, basically. It's the opposite of clinging. It's the opposite of holding on. And the Buddha said that if we truly knew the value of generosity, we would not let one meal pass by without sharing it. And generosity sometimes is described as the first step on the Eightfold Path, because it provides that basis for us to practice sila, practice ethics, which is the foundation of the path, and so on. And that leads us to, when we can practice ethics, we can meditate. We can meditate better. We haven't got it provides the foundation for meditation, and meditation produces wisdom, compassionate wisdom. So dana leads to joy, and it also leads to a recognition of the connection with others. It's a sort of an opening up. It's a release of what we're clinging to, and it is a wonderful way of developing happiness, like the wealth of happiness. Coming back to these 10 perfections, they are real achievements. Often in the world we think about how much we can achieve in terms of wealth and status and our jobs and all sorts of other things. We might keep in mind how much we can achieve, but the trouble with those worldly achievements is that they're very impermanent. They go quickly. As soon as conditions change, they change, or the value of them changes. And of course, at death, all our achievements have to, they're all the wealth, all the status, everything that we think we've achieved will have to vanish. It just disappears. We can't take it with us. So when we think about these paramis or these perfections, it's like something that we can really achieve. It's like something we can have that we can take with us. Whether you believe in rebirth or not, it doesn't matter, because when you cultivate these qualities, it is like a real treasure. It's something that lives on with you. I was speaking to someone earlier in the week who had recently lost a lot of money because they weren't able to work. They had to look after their children. A lot of money, like a couple of million actually. And that was because they saw their children were in trouble, and they decided to work towards looking after their children rather than following their corporate career. And in the process, they lost a lot of money, but what they developed was this amazing, wonderful relationship with their children. What he developed was compassion, he developed generosity, he developed the principles of ethics. He developed something that was of much more value than, financial wealth can give us. So coming back to generosity, I did hear a story about this coming home from the retreat I was on that I just taught a couple of weeks ago. I was listening to a wonderful British monastic who speaks Thai very well. I was listening to his talk in Thai, and he was talking about dana. And he said that something like this. He said, if you think about happiness, dana is a true investment in happiness. It's a true investment in the wealth of happiness. Dana being generosity. And he said, imagine, for example, we have a large cake and we eat that cake. We slice it up and we eat it all to ourselves. It gives us a certain amount of pleasure. Maybe it'll give us 10 minutes worth of pleasure while we're eating it. But that's it. But imagine if you have that lovely, delicious cake and you slice it up and you give a piece to 10 friends. And in the giving to the 10 friends, there's a joy in your generosity. And they really appreciate it as well. So you have your little piece, and that gives you maybe 3 minutes of sensual pleasure immediately. But in the long term, it will be a joy and a pleasure that you can, the joy of generosity will be something you can recollect and be happiness for years to come. And he actually gave an example of how he had given some money to someone who was really destitute. And like 20 years later, just the thought of it brings joy to his heart. So it's a really good investment. It's a good investment in true wealth, the wealth of happiness. The next parameter, the next parami, is virtue. And virtue I'd like to think of as impeccable ethics. And impeccable ethics, or ethics in general, is the foundation of the path, the Eightfold Path. I said dana was very important. Dana is fantastic because it cuts to the core of our clinging. It lets us let go of our clinging to material things, for example, and it gives us the basis of joy so that we can walk on the path and we're more able to practice ethics. Now, ethics is the foundation of the path. Ethics is the foundation of meditation. Without ethics, it's like I used to make this joke, you can't kind of rape, pillage and plunder by day and meditate at night because it just won't work. Unless you're a psychopath, but then, if you're a psychopath, you're not going to make much progress in that with that anyway, because sometime or other those deeds are going to catch up with you. So you can't meditate at night because, well, I can't. Even if I do something minimally harmful towards someone, it really affects me. If I've hurt someone in some way, I can't sit very well. I have to kind of resolve it or amend it or absolve it somehow. And this is an example of ethics. It's like when we can maintain ethics, it gives us a real power. It builds not only does it build our character as being someone who's very reliable and trustworthy, but it also protects our well-being and happiness into the future. I did hear Ajahn Chah. Well, I heard about Ajahn Chah. I think I read this, saying to some lay people one time, they were worried about their practice, and he said, "Are you maintaining ethics?" And they said, "Yeah, we're impeccable ethics." And he said, "Well, if you're maintaining ethics, there's nothing really to worry about, because you're not creating bad karma. Bad karma, by karma I mean actions. You're not creating the causes for suffering into the future. If you're maintaining ethics, you're building up a strong and powerful state of presence that will give you the capacity to meditate, to cultivate your mind, and to arrive at wisdom. And it gives you a clean conscience. And it's also a way we cultivate equanimity, actually. So how do we cultivate ethics? Well, we just do it. We just do it. And I'll talk about making vows in a little bit. But if we say make the determination to be truthful, for example, then with that determination, that strong intention, we can be truthful and we can reap the benefits of being truthful. And on retreats, I'll invite people to practice the 5 Sila, but it's an invitation to practice the 5 Sila for life. 5 Sila, restraint in killing living beings, restraint in taking that which doesn't belong to us, restraint in speech that's harmful and divisive and untruthful, deceptive, restraint in sexual misconduct or sensual misconduct, which is conduct of the senses that actually harm somebody, either yourself or another. Even if, say, if you're having an affair and your partner didn't know, you say, "Oh, she doesn't know, it's not going to hurt her." But it does hurt you somehow. It does hurt her somewhere along the track. It's just a deception. And the last precept, of course, is restraint in intoxicants that cloud the mind, because if we have an unclear mind, we're likely to ruin all the other precepts anyway. So virtue is a wonderful parami, and just to develop that is the pathway to awakening. But even in daily life, in our mundane activities in daily life, it is a way of being happy. It is a way of being calm and peaceful, because we're not creating anything that will cause suffering in the long run. Okay, the next parami is patience. And patience, it's kind of interesting. Patience is the willingness for Dharma, or the nature of life, to unfold in its own natural time frame, rather than an ego pushing for outcomes. And being able to wait patiently is wonderful. I had an experience yesterday, actually. I was preparing this talk, and in between seeing clients in my practice, and then I had to go and pick my car up because I put it in for registration. the registration certificate. And then I wanted to pay the registration because it had the certificate. So I looked at the form and it said go online or pay by BPay, but you have to get the BPay number by going online or phoning this number. So I tried to get onto Services New South Wales website, and it just got me in a loop. Every time I went to get the number for the BPay number, it said do this, and then I go there and then it says get the BPay number, and I go back. There was a never-ending loop, and then I decided to phone them instead. So I got on the phone and they said, oh great, okay, you need to put in your registration number. No, not the registration number, the invoice number or something. There was some number that I had to put in. So I put it in by my phone, on my computer, and then it just said, there are not numbers in this number. You got to look at it, you got to find it here. So I spent 10 minutes just going around in a loop, and I noticed my irritation building, and I remembered, patience. This is a good quality. This is a parami. This is a wonderful opportunity. I'll be patient. It's a much better investment to invest in patience than it is to invest or be sucked into irritation and frustration and that whole kilesa, that whole hindrance of ill will. So that's one. The next parami is energy. I'm just reading two words there together. Energy. Sometimes you can call it diligence or persistence or perseverance. And energy is a factor of awakening, as I mentioned earlier, one of the seven factors of awakening. It is also a power. It's one of the five, called the five powers. And it is also one of the factors on the Eightfold Path, right effort. And right effort is often spoken of as having 4 exertions. And listen to these and kind of, it might help you understand these 4 exertions. The first exertion is the energy involved in stopping an unwholesome pattern. The energy in short-circuiting something unwholesome. Like, for example, I showed energy yesterday when I noticed that I was getting more and more irritable with this. It's like I was being irritable with someone, but there was nobody there. It was just this website getting me caught up in loops. I noticed irritation arising and I started to swear to myself, fuck, why are they doing this? But I noted it. The energy to see that and stop it is called a right exertion. The next right exertion, or the next exertion, is the energy involved in protecting ourselves from falling into a negative pattern. Okay? So the first one is stopping a negative pattern. Second one is preventing a negative pattern. The third exertion is the effort and energy involved in doing or acting or having a wholesome behavior, having a wholesome tendency, doing something wholesome and helpful. And the next exertion is the effort or energy involved in maintaining that wholesomeness, if that makes sense. It's a good way of understanding energy. And it builds character. How do we do it? Well, we do it with mindfulness, actually, because there's a balance of right energy. And in the Eightfold Path, when we talk about right effort, which is right energy, it's often talked about as balancing as not too much and not too little. And the Buddha made an analogy of tuning a lute. And if you tune the lute too tight, it doesn't sound good. So if you're putting too much effort into something, it's not right. It kind of destroys it or distorts it. And putting too much effort into meditation can be a big problem sometimes. If you put too little effort into it, it's like loosening the guitar string off or the lute string off to where it's really slack, and that's also not good. You don't make any progress. So it's a matter of balancing this energy in a way that's right for the circumstance and right for you. The next parami, and by the way we cultivate that, well, I mentioned the 7 factors before. When we are mindful, when we begin to practice mindfulness, like the first factor on that, the 7 factors of awakening, it leads us to be curious about something, leads us to investigate something. And what happens after that is we naturally have this sense of energy or persistence or willingness to kind of get into something, perseverance, a diligence. It's sort of, we get so interested in something that it naturally leads us to want to invest our energies into that. So that's one way. Another way is just to make those resolves. Yes, I'm going to put energy towards this, and notice the quality of energy and fine-tune it. The next parami that I'd like to talk about is truthfulness. And truthfulness, in essence, is right speech. And if we can be honest with ourselves in general, then we will not be self-deceiving and be able to wake up. If we're not honest in general, it tends to kind of come back on ourselves. If we're not honestly looking at what's happening in the world and being like in ourselves, for example, and naming it and seeing it for what it is, we tend to get, we tend to get self-deceiving. We're not giving ourselves the facts. We're not being truthful with ourselves. And if we're not truthful with others, it gets really complicated. I know there's a saying, when at first we do deceive, oh, what a vicious web we weave. And I thought it was Shakespeare, but it's not. It's someone else. It's another playwright. But it's so true. When you tell a little lie, then you have to back it up with other lies, and it gets really quite complicated. And just even kind of little deceptions, it just gets so more and more complicated, and we end up not being able to see truth from deception in the long run. When we're awakened, we have nothing to hide. And we also have the courage to be responsible for actions, so we don't have to deceive anybody. This quality of truthfulness, which is a decision actually, builds a strong character that is valuable in our everyday life, as well as it enables us on the path to awakening. The next parami that I'd like to talk about is renunciation. And renunciation, another way of describing renunciation is letting go. And what we can see with renunciation is that if we can let go of gross pleasures, for example, what actually happens is we have more subtle and refined pleasures. We have more subtle and refined ways of well-being. And it's not that we have to let go of everything. We can use those subtle and refined states of well-being to help us on the path. But it's that capacity to let go of the clinging to lower hedonic pleasures for a greater pleasures. And there's a lot we could talk about with pleasure, and I've given whole talks on this, and but it's like the Buddha said, don't be afraid of pleasure, but also be cautious of sensual pleasure. Pleasure that is derived from when we get caught up in worldly activities. It's not that there's nothing wrong with pleasure, but unless we cling to it, but there's such a more refined pleasure to be found in a concentrated mind, as well as an ethical life. And in fact, the Greek term eudaimonia is the happiness that comes from living an ethical and virtuous life versus hedonic pleasures that come from the gratification of the senses. So renunciation is a way of letting go of our addictions and finding something more enduring and satisfying in life. Discernment or wisdom is the next one, and there's so much I could talk about with wisdom, but I'll be brief as best I can. Wisdom, I know many of you who've done things with me will recognize that when I do groups with people, I don't tell them what I think wisdom is. I ask them what they think wisdom is, because everyone knows what wisdom is for them. And I'm really honored to hear what people say about wisdom. And then I might say how wisdom is understood in the Eightfold Path. And in the Eightfold Path, it is understood as right view and right intention. So it's the two components. Those two factors on the Eightfold Path represent the wisdom factor, the wisdom component of the Eightfold Path. So right view is basically seeing the way things are, having insight into the way things are, seeing them clearly, and seeing a pattern, for example, we might be on. We might be doing something. It's when we can stop and look at something, when we have the courage and the determination and the resolve to look at something, we begin to see how it's operating. When we have the courage to look at the kilesa, for example, or stop and acknowledge that we're caught up in an unwholesome pattern, something that's going against what we may truly value. When we have that courage, when we can see it, we begin to understand it. We begin to see how it arises and how it changes and how it passes away. And with that seeing, we make a decision. We make a decision. Do we want to continue with this, or do we want to continue to be caught up in this perpetuation of suffering, or do I want to do something different? Do I want to be freer? And that decision is the second part of wisdom in the Eightfold Path. It is intention. It's an intention to do something different. And in Buddhism, there's three aspects of right intentions. They are intentions of renunciation or letting go, intentions of harmlessness, like not doing harm, just the intention to avoid harm, and the intention of goodwill. And when I say goodwill, I mean like loving kindness, for example, or warm benevolence, warm friendliness, compassion, appreciation, appreciative joy, and so on. So when we do that, when we can see something clearly, then we make a decision about something, about this, what we're seeing clearly, then we act on it. And many of you know about acceptance and commitment theory, and I'll borrow something from this particular therapeutic approach. They have something called the hexaflex, which is 6 therapeutic components. One therapeutic component is valued direction. And another, what follows on from that, is committed action. So valued direction is like getting clear on what's really important for us. And committed action is actually acting on it. Acting on what's really important for us. Acting in ways that are consistent with what's really important with us. I think this link is really helpful. Something about acting on something that's really important for us, there's a commitment to it. there's a commitment to act on what's really important for us. So coming back to the Eightfold Path and wisdom, wisdom is like seeing something clearly with insight, then making an intention to avoid, to move out of the suffering that what we're seeing, Then we act on it with ethics, actually, with ethical behavior. And in this case, it be behaviors of body, speech, and mind, or right speech, right action, right livelihood, that is in line with our clear seeing, our clear insight, and our best intentions. So wisdom here is liberates us in the long run, and wisdom includes compassion. Wisdom includes goodwill. I think wisdom is kind of universally accepted as a good quality, regardless of what teachings you go to. In Buddhism, it is called a perfection. It is one of the perfections, sorry. The eighth perfection is called determination, and I've talked about this a little bit more in terms of energy, but determination is really reflected in having a resolve or a commitment. And I mentioned commitments just in the last point. And it's when we have a clear vision of what's good for us and what's not good for us. And then we make a clear decision, a firm decision, a committed decision to act in ways that are very helpful for ourselves and others. That's what I would call determination, and then acting on it. So there's this commitment to act and acting on it. When we can make resolves, such as the resolve to maintain the 5 precepts in life, which many people take them on a daily basis. They're kind of ingrained with me. They're background guidance, and they're not something that someone else imposes on you. They're decisions we've made within our own hearts in knowing what's good for ourselves and what's good for others. And when we take those precepts, it's like we're taking a vow or a resolve to act in that way. It strengthens our path. When we have these determinations or these resolves, it helps us not to be confused about what we're doing. It helps us stick on the path that we've chosen. It gives us a powerful direction. It helps us make decisions. Something's in line with your resolve or not. You either go down the path that's not in line with it, or you go down the path that's in line with it. And if you made a resolve, if you made a decision, if you made a firm commitment to it, then you're more likely to stick to it. Firm resolves, however, like when we make a vow and determination, we have to be careful that it's smart, like specific, measurable, realistic, achievable, and time measured. It's not. We shouldn't make resolves to do something impossible. Now, the Buddha actually made a firm resolve to not get up from underneath the Bodhi tree until he was enlightened on the night of his awakening. I think it'd be pretty foolish for me to make such a resolve. But anyway, the reason I'm talking about this determination is that it's really powerful. It's a wonderful thing to cultivate. And the way you cultivate it is by just making resolves and reaping the benefits of them. When you make a resolve and you stick to it, it's this happiness that comes from, it's a sort of not a pride, but a increasing confidence and a strengthening and an empowering. You build a strong character. The other two paramis, one parami. So I'm just looking at 2 birds up in the back. They're having a battle. It's interesting. The next one is goodwill, which includes metta and compassion. Goodwill can be found on the Eightfold Path. Goodwill can be found as a good intention, a right intention. as well as a practice. And we mentioned earlier, we did the practice of loving kindness earlier, and I encourage you to have that sense of boundlessness. When we have loving kindness, genuine loving kindness, or metta and compassion, it's like we're living like an appreciative joy. It's like we're living in an awakened state. It's a sense of freedom. It's a sense of boundlessness. It automatically dissolves ill will, and it's a wonderful way of relating to ourselves and others. It is something that can be cultivated, and it helps us live in a divine and beautiful way. The next one is equanimity. This is another parami, and I'll just there's another sub one that's mentioned in the Mahayana ones. The Mahayana 6 paramis includes jhana, or meditation, and I'll just mention that briefly. Meditation is the way we cultivate, cultivate wisdom. Actually, when we can concentrate, we have a mind fit for purpose. It's like I was unconcentrated a little bit earlier because I was getting distracted with the way technology was working, and I noticed that kind of put me off track. But if we can concentrate, we can stay on track, and we can go deeply into whatever we're doing effectively. So this is a wonderful quality to cultivate. It's a wonderful quality to strengthen. And the last parami that I would like to talk about very, very briefly is equanimity, although I could talk about it for hours. But in brief, equanimity is the culmination of the 7 factors of awakening, as I mentioned earlier. It is also a result of practicing insight meditation. It is also a result of practicing serenity meditation in a different way. And it is also what happens when we live an impeccably ethical life. We start to be very centered. We start to be unshaken. We're unshaken by the worldly winds, the 8 worldly Dharmas, which are praise and blame, loss and gain, pain and pleasure, fame and disrepute. Pain and pleasure, loss and gain, fame and disrepute, and praise and... Let me go back over them. Praise and blame, loss and gain, pain and pleasure, and fame and disrepute. Yeah, I said them. 8 worldly winds. So they're... these 8 worldly winds are what shake us around. And when we can cultivate equanimity, we are stable and centered and unshaken. We have a realistic perspective, a wise perspective on life. And we're no longer sucked into being caught up with stuff. So, thank you for your attention. And I hope that you can see how working with the kilesa and cultivating the wholesome, such as the paramitas, or the perfections, are not only a way of building a very good character, not only a way of finding peace and happiness in our daily lives, but they are also the way of the Bodhisattva, a path on the being, a being on the path of awakening for all sentient beings. So thank you very much for your attention, and we'll have a few moments silence, and then we'll have some discussion.